Alright guys, in this video we're going to start our shading segment, and the first thing that we're going to want to do is to work on a shading scale, which all we're really going to need is mechanical pencil or possibly like a 2B pencil, your charcoal pencil, because now we're moving into using charcoal. It can be your soft one, it can be just any of the charcoal pencils you have, because we're basically going to make a line of 1-inch squares, and we're going to go from darkest values to lightest values. And so for this initial setup, we're going to go, let's see, we're going to go 8 squares, 8 1-inch by 1-inch squares, so we can just make that with a ruler real quick. They don't have to be exact, I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you definitely want to be relatively the same. If it's not like a perfect 1-inch by 1-inch square, the whole point here is to use your charcoal pencil as a tool and go be very dark on one end, and essentially you're using the white of the paper as your lightest value. That's typically, most drawings will have the white of the paper be the lightest value. You're basically making a rectangle. Notice how I'm not totally precise with this, but we all know we can make it perfect if we want. So I'm just making these 1-inch by 1-inch squares. You can do more if you want. You can do as many as you want. The more you do, the more sensitive the value changes are. And so when we talk about value, we're talking about how light or dark the objects from light and shadow. So when we say value, we're actually talking about the intensity of the light on an object and the shadows on an object. Because depending on where the light's coming from, depending on the shape of the object, it can have many different values. So we're not going to go into drawing objects quite yet. We're just going to, it's almost like we're taking a simple language and we're going to go darkest here on the left and lightest. Actually, I think we should do 9 squares. We'll do 9 squares because then we can have a really nice lightest. Scratch that, because we want to have 1 square for the middle value, and that's the most important thing, is to find your darkest square and your lightest square, and then find the middle value right in the middle. So for the darkest, I'm just going to lay in the pencil. This may actually take a little while. And yes, charcoal has a lot of dust, so be careful of that if you're at home. And so now, if the white of the paper is the lightest and this is the darkest, we're essentially going to be lightening the dark values until we get to that middle square, and darkening in until we get to the middle. So if you want, you actually could start with a middle value, and what that means is, notice how I'm holding the pencil and I'm using light touches. So except for the darkest value, you're going to want to use light pressure. Be careful, because look, see how it's a little bit darker at the top? Just going to smooth that out a bit. be very aware of how much pressure you're putting on your implements. If you want, you can get really interesting. If there's a blending stub, it'll really smooth it out for you. Make sure to blow away the dust. And so there we go. And that was done with very light pressure. So you've got 3 squares to go from that to that. So how do we do that? Well, this square, ultimately, I'm laying down a very small amount of charcoal. So what do we think? Is that too dark? Well, if you think it's too dark, you can take your eraser, and with the eraser, you can just lighten up that value. Notice how I'm just using the edge of this eraser. So look how much lighter that just got. And we're just trying to discover our sensitivity, really looking at the values. So you're not looking at shadows and light on objects yet. You're just looking at, with a basic tool here, you're looking to make a value gradient. So yes, having a blending stump, or you could use a paper towel, you could use a actually, you might really get a lot of traction out of using this eraser to help lighten these up a bit. And really try to keep it as uniform across the square as possible. Now you can see there's a little bit. So I think it's just a little. And this is when it gets tricky, is when you start to get, the closer and closer your values get, the harder and harder it is to get a smooth transition from one to the other. So if you look at it right now, this is definitely a bit darker than that. Like I said, try to keep the value uniform. So we may want to just hit this slightly, get that middle value. So you can see, even between these two, there is a slight difference there, and that's what it should be. It should not be, because we're doing 9 different values, the closer and closer some of these get to each other, so you can see there's a natural progression of the values. And so it's essentially the same thing now. You can work it, you want to go a little bit darker than your middle value here, which means you're going to be laying in. Notice how I'm holding the pencil at the kind of the end at a long angle, so that I can really control the pressure. So be careful when you get up to that edge that you're not pushing down too hard and making the edges too dark. So really get the hang of laying in your charcoal, using your blending stump, blend that in. Then you can decide if you need to use the eraser to lighten it, smooth it out, because it's up to you. It depends on how sensitive you are to the shifts in value here. It's really going to play an important role when we start working with objects. How sensitive you are to the light and darks of your values. So, a great word to know is value. That's what we're working on. It's value for this. And the larger term would be shading. And that's what's going to give three-dimensionality to our objects, is that form of light and shadow around the three-dimensional form of the object. So I could continue now and get darker and darker until we get right up to that. But I want to see a smooth transition. Really make sure that you can see a difference, especially in the middle tones, from there. Really make sure you can get sensitive